You're listening to the Overfunctioning Leadership Podcast, learning leadership concepts through life experience. Hello, friends. Welcome to another podcast sponsored by Overfunctioning Podcast. I am Alex.
I'm John.
And I'm Zach.
And we are going to be talking about conflict today. I haven't decided whether or not I'm going to punch Zach in the face during this podcast.
It's what we're deliberating. Does he hit me or not?
I'm going with 50-50.
50-50 shot.
As I always like to ask people, do I deserve it?
And based off of our last episode, I've been ruminating over something between you and I, what I will not directly talk to you about.
Of course, you can't talk about it.
Yes, of course, I'm not going to bring that up.
I'm going 70-30 now.
Vegas odds have went up. It's minus 200. I have no idea what that means, but
It's always
sounds
confused
like
me.
you put in $100. Anyways, so that's what we are going to be talking about. It is episode number 34, which is whose episode, John?
I'm going with Greg Pruitt, so former Cleveland Brown, and the wearer of the tearaway jersey. So that was famous from mid-1970s.
Now, it was buttons, like snap buttons, or was it Velcroed?
It was the jerseys were so thin that when you tried to tackle them, the person would fall off with the jersey in their hand, and the person would run for a touchdown wearing just shoulder pads.
Oh, okay. All right. So you just got to make sure you're not grabbing at certain parts.
Right.
Okay.
More sports references, which Zach is really excited
Sports
about.
Team Argo.
Okay. Anyway, so last episode, we had somebody that John knows really well, Tom. Tom Moyer was on and talked to us about rumination. So instead of clearly having John talk about this and recapping this, let's just go right to Zach.
So John has a brother, which we just recently discovered. They look almost exactly the same, not really a point of conversation. And he came with this topic of rumination, something he's experienced in his life. And it's the well-trodden path of the mind that doesn't really take you anywhere. Well, there's positive rumination, which takes you somewhere. It helps you lead to an end. It's constructive. It leads to a solution to what it is that you're approaching, or at least takes you somewhere. Whereas negative or depressive rumination takes you nowhere. It leads you in the same path over and over and over, and it's just a cesspool of stress that leads to negative effects such as lack of sleep, red eyes, being alone.
A sore jaw.
A sore jaw. TMJ.
Uh-huh. Yeah, TMJ.
Yeah.
It's no good.
No good.
So there we go. There we have it. That was go ahead and give that a listen. It's pretty good. Tom has it on his LinkedIn account, so if you can't find us there.
Anywhere else that we're listed, check his LinkedIn.
Anyway, so before we talk about conflict in all its formats, I'm going to bring a fable to us here. So buckle up in your SUV that has a ladder attached to the back and get ready for this fable. So I'll be bringing the fable. I am a student council advisor, and homecoming week is actually next week. And so it's quite a stressful time for all of us, including me and my other co-advisor and the executive board and everybody else. Anyways, so when it comes to conflict, I actually see it quite often within student council. And maybe it's just easier to diagnose because you have high schoolers who are trying to learn how to, function as people, but also with other people. It makes it kind of fun to watch. And maybe that's why, John, I don't know about you, but part of being a high school teacher is just to watch the younger people interact with the other younger people and see the ridiculousness that they walk through is always kind of fun. Anyways, but where I see this conflict manifest a lot is that you have a committee that are working on a parade, per se. And so there's let's say there's 10 people on this committee. Well, there's 2 or 3 people work in the committee real well, and then you have some people who are not really plugged in and don't know exactly what's going on because they haven't been told. Well, over time, this conflict builds to where the people who don't know what's going on don't approach the people who know what's going on, And so they get like more angry at them, but they don't approach them to actually figure out because they're afraid to approach them because they think if I approach them, they think that I'm like subverting their authority. And so it's just like it all snowballs. And then when homecoming comes and they actually have to put on their event, at times there's this really interesting right there in front of your face conflict where they start getting angry at each other because they didn't do something and they didn't know, but they didn't know what they were supposed to do. And they were ruminating over it and thinking, I'm not going to bring this up. So it's just one giant ball of conflict that none of them actually wanted to approach. But right now it's turning to acute anxiety, and now we have to do something about it. So that's the life I live right now. It's really just quite a joy.
It's glamorous.
I really do enjoy it, and it's good for students because this is a really good opportunity for them to learn how to go through conflict, not in a work-like setting where they could be fired. So. Anyways, so that opens us up to conflict. We're actually going to be looking at 3 different positions of conflict because, we're all about triangles and whatnot. But before we get there, I think John actually has something to say.
Well, I thought it would be helpful for our listeners and for me to define what conflict is. Mm-hmm. So I just went to dictionary.com, and it says to come into collision or disagreement. Interesting, the word collision. Mm-hmm. To be contradictory, opposition, to clash, to fight, or to do battle.
Clash of Clans.
Mm-hmm. Con Air. That's where my mind went.
Snakes on a Plane.
No, mostly Con Air because Nicolas Cage is in that. Anyways, so there is overall conflict. From what you've brought it to, there's from the definition that John has given, we're going to look at that in 3 different ways. Mm-hmm. 1, initiating conflict. 2, receiving the conflict, and 3, observing the conflict. And then what do those look like, and then what are you supposed to do with them? So, Zach, I'm pretty sure you brought this up, so we're going to start right with you, sir. Initiating conflict, what does that mean?
Yeah, so initiating conflict is obviously the person who is starting that spin of events. They've brought something to someone else, either intentionally or unintentionally, causing conflict. There's some difficulties where you say something that causes conflict that you're not aware of and people don't bring it to you. And so when I was thinking of this issue, that's the role that I was imagining. Someone has said something to you that you feel you need to resolve. It's increased your anxiety, it's increased your conflict, and you have to take a conversation that happened a while ago, or you have to take whatever it is, and you need to approach someone and say, hey, this is what's what, and we need to talk about it. And it's going to be a tough conversation because of how you think they might react emotionally, or the what ifs that you envision. And so the question is as the initiator, how do you initiate conflict well? Things that go through your head. How do you initiate conflict well? How do you take something that might be controversial or is not intended to start conflict and deal with that? And then, how do you be a good old chap while doing all these things?
Okay, so let's start with how. So your first question was, how do you initiate conflict well? My mind goes towards feeling and thinking. That's the first thing. I imagine that there may be, when you want to initiate the conflict, I'm guessing that the feeling portion of your brain should probably be put somewhere in the right state of mind, right?
Yeah.
That you don't want to just go into this feeling everything and then get into literally a collision or a brawl with somebody. But it needs to be more of a thoughtful based.
Yeah, I think pronouns matter in this context. So sharing with somebody, this is how I see it, this is my perspective about the situation, and then offering you might see it differently. So and I'm playing a role here, but what I want to share with you is how I see this situation, and I'm interested to hear your perspective, and then sharing your viewpoints in a thoughtful way, and then saying to the other, perhaps you have a different viewpoint and I'd like to hear that. And then allowing them to talk and not get defensive, not to interrupt. It's the idea of trying to get the facts out of your perspective and then allowing another to also share the facts as they see them. And I think that can help with getting some type of resolution to the battle, as the dictionary defines it.
I mean, that's a crazy distinction, to make sure that you're using I language rather than you language, because the facts that you know as they pertain to you doesn't mean you know the facts of someone else. So let you speak with I language and let I speak with I language as I speak with grammatical fluency.
Aye, aye, Captain.
Arg me, matey.
So why aren't people doing this? Why are they not initiating conflict in this way?
Yeah, what stops people from initiating conflict, and why shouldn't it?
Well, I've been working with a leader for the last year and a half or so who has told me that they avoid conflict because to them, conflict always meant a fight. And in their position, they actually can't allow for out and out fighting. So because it would bring problems to this particular organization if you had this going on. Because in their family growing up, conflict always meant fighting, arguments, hurt feelings, slam doors. They just didn't know how to have it in a healthy way. So I think one reason is in some families it's never been observed, handled correctly.
Can I go on a ledge here? I'm going to say that most families, conflict probably hasn't been handled in the best way. And that would be because why? Is it difficult? I mean, this is something different. I mean, this is scary. Walking into initiating a conflict, there's a lot of risk involved. There's a risk of hurting people's feelings, hurting your own feelings. All of these things are all out there in the forefront. Feeling-based.
For those who have listened to the podcast often may be tired of me referring to the SCARF model and David Rock, but look at the 5 letters.
Every episode.
Every episode. Oh, gosh. Here we go.
It's like it's one of the core concepts that would help you handle life better.
Yeah.
Ugh, we hate acronyms, don't we, Alex?
It's not even winter yet.
Well, just scarf it down and
Take
take
your
your
that makes me
medicine.
feel better. Oh, good. Okay,
Take your
good,
medicine.
Good.
But look at conflict in the SCARF model. S is status, so I win, you lose. You win, I lose. There's that. The certainty piece, the unknown of how is this going to go? This could go south really quick. The autonomy piece, like I have no control how this is going. It could fracture our R, the relatedness piece, and could lead to an unfair outcome. So I would say 5 for 5 letters of the SCARF model are in jeopardy with conflict. Therefore, we avoid it like the plague.
Mm-hmm.
And where did we land on that conversation of lose, 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 win, win, win? Did we determine that there are win-wins?
The Steelers and Browns game a few weeks ago was a win-win. They tied.
Yeah, which is like kissing your sister. So isn't that a loss?
Have you seen my sister?
Yes, actually, I have seen your sister.
At a podcast.
At a pod. She was sitting right to the right of me.
It was a wonderful episode. So get a listen to that if you haven't heard that one.
And never directly address the question of who kissed whose sister.
Yes, exactly.
So, but going off of that, I think a big part of this conversation is sort of societally based, right? I don't know, I was struggling with that word there. It's societally based. We look at our political system, and we have two sides that we'll call them seemingly equal, warring against the other, where there's a win-lose situation. There's no middle ground, and I read a book, Thank You for Arguing. It was one of the biggest things that influenced me in my college career. Just a great resource where a college professor sits down and he anecdotally talks about how he's raising his kids to argue persuasively with rhetoric, and how that's a lost art from, you look to Grecian Roman times, and rhetoric was huge, and how we've lost the ability to persuade people and take something that may have been perceived as a loss or a win and just make it into a battle of wills. And I think part of that is, one, we don't see that anymore. We don't see people persuading other people. We see people slinging either facts or feelings at the other and expecting a side change, because there has to be two sides apparently. And because of that, everything is integrally emotional. I'm either going to win or I'm going to lose. And as we know, failure is bad. Isn't that right, Alex?
Yes. Yeah. I fail. You're in my nerve all the time.
Yeah. Failure of nerve. That book, huh?
Ed Freeman. He's the best.
What a guy.
So, though, the question still remains, how are we going to do this? How can you do this well? How can you initiate conflict well?
Yeah, so what stops us? The fear of the unknown and the sheer emotionality of it.
Yeah, I think not being tied to an outcome.
Yeah.
Not being wedded to the way this has to be resolved. I think there's few things in life that are ultimate, this has to be this way. But it's hard to think that way if you're feeling a lot and anxiety is high. So I think it starts with getting a hold of yourself, like calming yourself down, whatever triggers you, whatever triggers me, being able to be more thoughtful myself. And then I think as one grows themselves up and becomes more mature, the way they approach that conflict can actually allow the other person to borrow self from them and be a little bit more calmer and thoughtful. So I think managing self is a really important first step.
Yeah, and one of the things that I coach people through when we discuss how to have conflict well, often in a job setting where it may or may not involve superiors, because they're either talking about someone else that they're having conflict and asking for the superior to resolve it, or they're going into direct conflict with the superior. It's the removing of the unknown. If you can manage your own self well enough, what unknowns can you take away from the other person that might reduce the reactivity of the situation? If you say how you're thinking, how you're feeling, and the outcome or issue that you're seeking or trying to address and resolve, then that's going to reduce the anxiety, because they know where you stand. And it's not a, what is this person trying to get out of me, the fear of how you're going to lose, but it's a situation of, this is what I'm trying to get to, or this is what I'm trying to resolve and answer, and how can we both get there?
I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, it's the same. Yeah, you're fighting the same battle. You're having ownership over the same thing.
It's essentially a triangle. You're putting yourselves and that person on the inside, and the outcome on the outside, and both looking at it that way.
And you've clearly presented who you are, what you're standing for, what you're thinking, what you're feeling. And so they're not looking at you as an unknown anymore.
Interesting.
Yeah, interesting. I don't know where this really fits in. It's not as profound as what you just said, but timing also, I think there's a part of this is timing too. So, posturing yourself, making sure that you are in the correct place. That way you can use eye language, and that you can properly triangle the situation and not another person or something, or a dog. Also, timing of when to approach another person at this, is if somebody's highly emotional at this point in time, probably not the best time to go approach them with this either. So, not saying that you avoid the person. Maybe you just don't talk about that thing that you have conflict about at that point in time. Anyways, just some thoughts there. So initiating conflict, a good thing, go do it.
Good thing, go do it. And another side of timing, I think, is if you've managed yourself and you know where you stand, and you understand what you're afraid of and what your unknowns are, and you've taken a step back and you've looked at yourself and what you're trying to get out of this, and it's logical and rational in nature and not emotional, you do have some level of control over the circumstances and environment. We've all been in that situation where we've come home after a long day, For me, it's when I was younger and going into my parents' house. For John, it might have been just the other week with his wife. Who knows? For Alex, I don't know. Misha barking at you the second you get home. Like, you come home after a long day and you're expecting to unwind, and they throw something at your feet. Your mom says, I have this list of chores for you to do, and you're just like, oh, I wanted 15 minutes to unwind. Like, that's not the time to resolve things. And so timing, Alex, it may be as simple as saying, hey, I know this is out there. Let's pick a time in the future so that we can address this rationally, so that this wasn't an unknown coming at you now, but you can prepare and think and rationalize about it.
It takes the edge off of that for sure.
I would agree.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I say the next posture is receiving conflict. So this is a very interesting place, because in the initial upfrontness of this is in some ways you have no control right at the beginning, because you could be at a place where what we're saying that this person approaching you is not, let's just go from a standpoint of not well self-differentiated. They come at you with conflict that you weren't ready for. What do you do? What's the best way that we can walk through? Somebody comes at you with conflict, very feeling-based, very in your face. What do we do in that position here, gentlemen? What are you thinking through?
Well, I had an example of this happened. So I do some teaching in the summers, and I was approached by one of the teachers that I teach at the end of a workshop day. And he basically told me he was tired of me demeaning him. Mm-hmm. And I was totally unprepared for this statement. And so I said, this really surprises me. So what's an example? And he gave me several examples of the way I responded to him in the large group that he found very demeaning. And you talk about trying to get up in the tree at this point. I really tried to stop. So finally I said to him, what would you like me to do? This is our last day together. What do you want me to see me to do? He said, I want you to answer my question directly, not try to be funny. I wanted you to shoot straight with me. And I said, okay. And so that's what I did on day 4. I interacted with him very little. Mm-hmm. So I tried to get out, what do you want me to do? And his response to me seemed acceptable and normal. I didn't, there's been times I've thought, what was really going on with that? And I even tried to get a better view of that week and how it went from a few others that I know, and to have them see how I was and whether they saw some truth to what he was saying. But anyways, so I tried to just ask him the question, what would you like me to do? And he told me the answer, and I said, I will do that. And, he left, and I think was kind of in a huff, and I just asked the question, what truth is in there of what he said? Where's the truth at? And I tried to really think about that, and I'm not sure what I concluded about that, but I tried to be thoughtful.
What do you think, Zach?
I think about, we call it scope creep in the software game. Someone tells you they want you to do something, and you say it'll take this long or this much money to do it. They say, okay. And then somewhere along the process, they say, oh, by the way, we'd like this, that, and the other. And you say, okay. And then when it comes out and it's either taking longer than they expect or more money, they don't like that. And so what John's saying is asking what is making you say this, but also what are you trying to accomplish, I think is huge, because it makes them think about where they're trying to end up. We sort of assumed in this question that the receiver is responding to someone from who's initiated it in an emotional manner, and I think very often that can be the case, but just taking a second to step back and look down and say, are they talking to me from a logical, rational perspective, or are they talking to me from an emotional? And another side of that, John said that he was he got other people's perspective, and I think that's huge too, as long as it's not a reactionary complaining situation where you're not going out and you're saying, let's turn this into a triangle where they're the problem. But rather saying, let's keep it focused on me. This is the situation. How can you help me resolve it by giving me perspective that I might not have otherwise had?
Yeah, or just to justify yourself.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I told, I spoke to two people separately that I have actually taught workshops before. They've been in my workshops. And I asked them, I need you to be truthful with me. I really, this is important to me that you be truthful. And I stopped and I made them say, okay. And I said, so here's what happened. And I didn't mention the person's name, but I had someone. So in your interactions with me in a large group, do you sense that I'm sarcastic and I'm demeaning to people? These are the words this person used. And so I wanted to get their perspective as objective as it could be and not be fused to me and not want to please me.
Yeah. I really like the point where you said, what do you want me to do? Because it changes it from a feeling based to you're, in a way, getting them to think about what's actually going on. And like what you said even last time, of you're basically triangling them again. Like, is this really about me, or is it about some sort? It could even be about the way that you're acting. It's not really about John. It's about like, what are the things, what's the sarcastic, let's focus this. Oh, okay, so I can change this action. It's not like changing actually who John is.
And I would almost guarantee, and I'm not going to diagnose another, I would almost guarantee you that I reminded him of someone in his family who he had a conflict with. I almost guarantee it's that. And I use that when I coach people. I was speaking with someone recently who was super irritated at somebody in their office. And I said, in your family, who is this person?
How are they triggering you?
And they said, this is my mother. I said, now you know why they irritate you so much. So you might find it, listeners, you might find that helpful of asking that question.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Yowzers.
Yeah. Jumping off of what you were talking about, Alex, with the triangling, I talked about this in the rumination episode too, but I think character is a huge part. We frame this specifically as convictions and guiding principles, but pick one about yourself. Who do you want to be? What kind of person do you want to be? If I'm coming to you, John, and I'm saying this is the kind of person that I see you as, mean, sarcastic, demeaning, you can say, let's turn this into a triangle, because the person I'm trying to be is not one who is that. And so let's reframe this as, this is who I truly am and what my intentions are. These are the principles that guide me. Now, I'm on your side in the sense that I don't want to do actions that are like that. How can we reframe this so that I don't make you feel that way and I don't behave in a way that can be perceived that way? And I've found in my own experience, again, anecdotally, experientially, not a matter of fact or a precise psychological study, but that makes them reevaluate where they're coming from and what they're trying to get out of this. Why are they attacking you? What is the cause behind that? And then, is this something that really requires John to change? Or is it something where I need to look at myself and say, maybe I'm being a little more sensitive? But together, you end up analyzing yourselves and going towards this common goal of saying what is and what ought to be.
Yeah, and then when you're in this system or this experience where you're receiving this conflict, it's not putting up that wall right away of defense. It's not like a win-loss thing. Well, you say this, and you said I need to change this. Well, I know myself well. I didn't mean to do that. I mean, you could have easily just said to this guy, get out of here. I'm trying my best here. Whatever. Figure it out. I don't have to deal with you. But, like, it's that posture of, okay, humility, and maybe I'm not doing everything right. Maybe I'm not all there is to be, And even if you are doing, John, I don't imagine that you were doing anything to hurt this man whatsoever. But at the same time, just like you said, I mean, it comes down to he probably saw somebody else that you were exactly like, and that's why he doesn't really like you. So,
and I like what Zach said, that when conflict starts, it's a battle, me against you. But you said that through that process, that each of you begin to analyze yourself.
Right.
And I think that really is an important point.
I think it comes down a lot to perceptions, and it ends up being a battle of perceptions. You said earlier that you just a common way to approach this is finding the truth in what the other person said, and that's actually something that I've coached a couple of the people I've talked to through, is finding the kernel of truth that you can agree on and using that as the basis for the new discussion, because Ravi Zacharias, a great persuasionist, just in the manner of which he approaches things, he talks a lot about the underlying presuppositions in a question, and how when you change the question and you change those presuppositions, you take something that could have potentially been emotional or confrontational and intending to stir people up, and reframed it into something that requires a logical thinking.
it's almost like every podcast that we put out, there's a question that,
No, be too simple. Be too easy.
Okay, well, I think we're on to the third posture. You guys have been crushing this so far. The third posture, which is quite interesting, is the observing posture. So you're observing two people in conflict with each other. And as the observer, what do you do? Well, I guess I'll start since you guys are staring at me.
We're thinking.
Seems to me that from what we've talked about, as I become more self-differentiated, right? As I do that, I have an ability of being able to lower the anxiety of a system. So, within people in conflict with each other, am I part of the system that they're in, or am I not a part of the system that they're in? Because if I'm a part of that system, then I have the ability to influence that system and lower that anxiety if I am somebody working towards self-differentiated. So maybe that's even a first step of, okay, am I even within these people's atmosphere to be able to even influence what's going on here? You see two people conflicting, jumping within that triangle without even being, number one, accepted into it or allowed into it could make things quite sticky. But if you're part of that system, they know who you are, then you can have some influence over what exactly is going on there. So it almost begs the question: what is your role? Like, should you even care? Are you responsible for any of it? There's a lot of different things here.
I think it's helpful for especially some of our new listeners to define self-differentiation in the context that you said. Self-differentiation is essentially the notion of managing self in the midst of a tense situation. Mm-hmm. So the byproduct of doing that is it lowers the anxiety of the system. If I can manage self and be more thoughtful, then others can borrow that self from me and allow them to be more thoughtful in resolving their conflict.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's a question of the question ends up being past what is my role, but why should I speak? When John asked the people who had been perceiving it, that was a very obvious invitation to provide their perspective, their opinions, their perceptions, which is awesome. But what do you do when, and I think this is a more frequent situation, when you're an observer of conflict and no one has asked you to do anything? Do you give someone advice? I feel like that's where this ends up.
Well, we've talked about the podcast about how to give advice, right?
Uh-huh. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think we addressed the issue of what part of this conflict is mine to worry about. Mm-hmm. And I think it varies depending on your vested interest. But it's not always the case that one should volunteer their expert opinion when not asked. I would say more often than not, it's probably not a good idea, but there's exceptions, I think.
And it goes back to, are you a part of this? Are you actually a part of this conflict or not? And that's what you said. Are you, and a lot of times, from experience, obviously, you have two people conflicting, and somehow I've been triangled in the middle of this, and I know both sides of the story. This is kind of strange. Get out of that triangle. There's actually, within resilient leadership, 1.0,
They just call it regular. They just said resilient leadership. Sorry,
The vanilla.
I would have called it regular resilient leadership.
I think that's great. It's got
just-
a good ring to it.
Yes.
Anyways, the character in the story has two of his employees that constantly bicker with each other and don't see eye to eye thing, but he's in the middle of this triangle because they just go to him between everything. And so let's take that posture here, gentlemen. You are the observer, yet you are part of the triangle. How do you get out of that? What do you do? Now you've been invited in.
Ask questions.
Yeah, I think asking questions. I think effective leaders are in a lot of triangles, and I don't know that leaders should get out of triangles as much as they should define themselves in the midst of them. So, if it's two people who are having a conflict, especially if it's two subordinates and a boss, of the boss clearly defining the expectations that he has for the two people, and basically saying, I don't care if you don't like each other, but this is what I need you to do as an employee, and these are the expectations I have. And then their happiness with each other, or even their own personal happiness, is their responsibility. But I'm focusing on what needs to be done, like from a technical viewpoint, and I'm not going to worry about their relationship.
I think that when you, as an effective leader, are asking questions that help to provide a focal point to the issue, they don't. I almost imagine that when you're done with that issue, they feel like your presence meant something, but when they think back on it, it's like, well, what did he really do? I think back to when I was an RA in college, and I was asked by two residents to mediate an issue, and I remember just sitting there. And I don't know what effect. I actually didn't ask any questions or do anything, but they felt as if I had resolved something, and I think it's in part because they knew that I wasn't a reactive person, that I if there had been conflict, I would have dissipated it somehow, like they had this perception. But I think that's something to consider is when you're an effective leader, what are they going to remember that you did in there? Did you solve it technically? Did you tell them how to do it? Or did you guide them into doing it for themselves?
Yeah, because if you tell them how to do it, guess what's going to happen? You're going to be right back in the
Boom.
situation.
Yeah.
Because now they're dependent upon you to solve their problems.
I think the most helpful role for an observer in this standpoint, if you're mediating conflict like you mentioned, is to not allow the two battling factions to speak with one another in the midst of your presence. I think it's something like, okay, Jane and Fred were here, and I know there's been some disagreements. Jane, you had talked to me about mediating this. Jane, from your perspective, and Fred, I'm going to ask that you not say anything, please. But Jane, from your perspective, what is the fundamental problem? And let Jane talk directly to you. Now, Fred might interrupt, and at that point, you raise your hand and say, Fred, please. And let Jane talk. All right, so this is a triangle. I'm with Jane. Now I turn to Fred, and I say, okay, Fred, you heard what Jane said. What are your thoughts? And then have Fred respond. And keep going back and forth between Jane and Fred. What that allows is your calm questioning and presence, as you mentioned, allows both of them to be a little more thoughtful because you've managed your anxiety in a very tense situation, and they can borrow self from the person that's in that triangle as the observer, and they can really offer some help in helping them be a little more thoughtful in this conflict.
Interesting. I think another thing that can be done is having a relationship with that person beforehand. And I say that because it's a lot easier to come into something uninvited, knowing the conflict, and being able to speak to the conflict without actually speaking to it. And what I mean by that is if I know Alex and I know Alex is in some sort of spiff, and I know that Alex wants to be a kind, patient listener, and I notice he's being impatient, he's being unkind, and he's being rude, I can say, hey, Alex, regardless of this conflict and what's going on, I know that this is the kind of person that you're trying to be, and reminding them that this is something that how he wants to present himself in all circumstances. That's why it's a guiding principle. And I think that can be helpful too, having that relationship, having already been curious about them before you need to be.
Interesting.
So John's speaking a lot about almost the baseline, in some ways, a baseline of, okay, as a boss, as a leader, I have, regardless of where these people are at and whether the relationship I'm in, I still need them to work together. So these are some practical ways we get them to work together. The other side of this too is that within that relationship with them, if you continue to self-differentiate with any of these postures, initiating, receiving, or observing any of these things, you can have that positive impact on that system, whatever's going on. And especially in the observing system, just like you said, you were sitting down with them. And the other side of this too is it is only a benefit for you to be more self-differentiated, to fix that system, but also a benefit to, through that, hopefully get your staff members or who the people you're influencing to a point in where they start becoming more self-differentiated as well. It is only a benefit. Just like, if you want to be selfish, go ahead. But working on yourself is going to make the other people, in turn, theory would suggest that they're going to want to also go in that direction because they've seen changes and they've seen things and how less anxiety and all of these things. And so it is that long road, but at the same time, it is, I don't want to make it so black and white, but it's only a benefit for a leader to do it.
And that is influence right there. That is what leaders, maybe I won't define it for everyone else, but for me, that is what really leadership is. That you can posture yourself in such a way that others can grow themselves up too alongside you, and it's really, really powerful. I also like what you said is it doesn't matter whether you're the initiator, the receiver, or the observer. In any of those positions, you can manage conflict. Whether it's initiating it, receiving it, or observing it, you can affect the system in positive ways in any of those three spots. And I thought that was really, really interesting.
Well, conflict.
Conflict.
I think we've got all sides of this covered.
Yeah.
And I mocked punch you in the face.
It hurt. It hurt. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will hurt forever.
So, anyways, I think we handled conflict pretty well here. Grow yourself up. That's a big part of it. So,
and this is a relevant topic because, we didn't directly address this, but leaders end up being mediators. And that's something that I don't think people realize. That can be tough.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, with that, you can check us out on iTunes, Google Play, YouTube, Simplecast. Where else?
The Facebook.
Oh, yes, the old Facebook, yes.
Overfunctioning Leadership. You should find us on Facebook. That's where we drop most of our news and, any interesting information about upcoming developments. Maybe check that out. Like us.
So if you're like plus 30 years old, you might be on Facebook still. So check it out.
Maybe post us a cute video of cats or some sort of hack that has been applicable in your life recently.
Also, you could check us out through email. Go ahead and send us an email. How is this done, John?
Well, you dial-up AOL on your dial-up modem.
Yeah. Ooh.
And wait for the. And then once you connect to the World Wide Web, you look us up on the email address is theof@gmail.com.
The of podcast.
The of podcast. Sorry, the of podcast. That is of UV. The of podcast @gmail.com.
OF. He's screwing this all up.
OF podcast.
I bet he had the volume a little too high when he was dialing up, and it just disoriented him.
It did, and it yelled, "You've got mail" at him.
Yes, I slept with my modem when I was a kid.
Wait, it's like your white noise?
Yes, it was. Yes. And you got mail. It was. It got me pretty excited.
Oh yeah. Your alarm in the morning.
Especially the Nigerian prince that needed extra money.
We've all gotten those emails. That and pills.
Okay, well, thank you, Jesse Huffstetler, for your awesome music. You can also find him. He is known as Jetler on
Spotify. He has a website that we post in our show notes.
Yeah.
Semi-frequently.
Yeah. So go ahead and spread your love out there and initiate some conflict.
Appreciate the people we appreciate.
Yeah, exactly. And with that, I'm Alex.
I'm John.
And I'm Zach.
And we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
See you around.